Okay, I think I'm like doubly mic'd up here, so if I'm talking too loud, I'll try to take it down. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about why we're here tonight and then what we're going to do tonight, and then introduce the speakers. So in that order, we're here tonight because we thought this was an interesting topic. The topic of rebuilding is obviously one that we've all become very familiar with here in New York since Sandy in 2012. The topic of relocating is something that we're just beginning to learn about and think about. There are other communities that have been learning about it before us and alongside us, and we wanted to bring some of that thinking in. So the idea was to just pause and take a look beyond New York and have the experience of people who've seen a broader view of how communities are tackling the issue of climate change. And that's how we got to Harriet, who I will introduce in a second. The way we're going to work this tonight is I will introduce all three of our, let's call them panelists. Harriet last, who's our keynote speaker. And then after that, we'll hear from Harriet. And then our panelists will give a brief sort of two brief soliloquies, shall we call it, and then we'll move into some questions to the three panelists that I will offer, and at the end of those, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So it sounds like a lot, but it will happen in bullet-like form, and we should be done here by about 8 o'clock, if not earlier. Okay, so I am going to try to introduce our three panelists and do it without glasses, which is always a challenge. So starting with Elizabeth, who is on the end. Elizabeth, maybe you could just wave and they will see you in a minute. Elizabeth Rush is somebody who I didn't know beforehand, but I can't wait to get to know better, not least because she's headed for Brown University, which is my alma mater and where my daughter is at college. So we have lots to talk about. But she is currently the Andrew Mellon Fellow for Pedagogical Innovation at Bates College, which is so impressive. I don't even know what it means. It's so impressive. But I do know I am more comfortable with books. And her book, Rising, Essays from America's Disappearing Shore, looked at 7 North American coastal communities, and that's part of the knowledge that she's bringing to us tonight. And she's looking at the experience of people who are very much on the ground in these communities, tackling the impact of climate change. She's also written for a bunch of magazines, Harper's and New Republic, it goes on, and she has just been awarded a Howard Foundation Fellowship to go and study at Howard University. And she told us while we were waiting that she has applied for yet another stipend to go to Antarctica. So wait till you hear about this one. So that's Elizabeth. And then David, who I actually did know, David Wagner, who I'm thrilled could join us tonight, is somebody that I have met in the course of my dabbling in resilience and climate change. He's president of Wagner and Ball, and it's an architecture practice that focuses on a variety of fields, from historic preservation to more modern institutional work, but also trying to connect the past with the present. I got to know David through work in New Orleans. He's been very involved in everything in that city, particularly since Hurricane Katrina. He really, I think, was in part responsible for bringing the Dutch water dialogues to New Orleans and being involved in a series of things that fell subsequent to that, including the National Disaster Resilience Competition. His work is not only extremely well known in New Orleans, but he's also worked in Connecticut, in Virginia, and he is pretty much an authoritative figure in the world of staying put and facing climate change. Last but not least, our keynote speaker, Harriet Tregoning, has come to us most recently from HUD, where she was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Community Planning and Development, which sounds like a lot of pieces. But what's particularly important is that she looked across the country, so not at any one region, across the country at towns, at cities, at states, to think about how to build a foundation for resilience in those places. And that goes beyond the physical. We're here, tonight to talk about physical, social, financial, a whole bunch of aspects, which is where Harriet's expertise comes in. I am slightly awed by Harriet because she has managed to hit not just the trifecta plus double time in federal government. So she served in the EPA, previously. She's worked in city government for the city of Washington, D.C. as director of planning, and she also worked in state government as secretary of planning in the Maryland state government. So she's somebody who really understands government at all levels, which is extremely important in getting anything done in this country, as you know. Harriet was a Loeb Fellow at the Harvard School of Design in 2004, and I think with that, I'll just turn the mic over to her.
Good evening. I'm really thrilled to see this great audience, and I'm very excited to be giving this lecture with being part of this panel and dialogue here at the New School and sponsored by the Happold Foundation. And I wanted to thank Kate for her help, Jacqueline Sachs as well. Jacqueline Hirsch and Sandra Sachs for all their support putting this event together. Every time I tell someone in Washington I'm going to New York, they say, "Are you going to go see Hamilton?" I'd love to go see Hamilton. All right, maybe I've seen Hamilton. I loved Hamilton. How many of you have seen Hamilton? It's if you've never heard of it, it's an acclaimed musical about the life of America's $10 founding father. Alexander Hamilton. He was the first Treasury Secretary. When Treasury was really not this kind of narrow department, it covered almost everything, particularly everything having to do with the economy, not just printing money and fiscal policy. In fact, he wrote a 1791 report on manufacturing that really spoke to the promise of what was a young republic at the time. And that promise would be best met, he said, by sparking the collective enterprise of its diverse communities. Now, if that's not a letter to us today, I don't know what is. He marveled at the busy nature of man, and I think that inclination to innovate is something I'm really glad to talk to you about here today, because that's the only thing that is going to really help us and help our communities out of what looks like is a pretty tough situation. Burrow Happold is a firm of engineers, and this was not part of my bio, and I don't normally talk a lot about it, but I'm actually, I studied civil engineering in college. I've been kind of faking it for 20 years as a planner. But I have to say, the thing I love most about engineers is that they're inherently problem solvers. And I think the big issue is that we've given engineers too narrow a set of problems to solve. Maybe when we had more money, even then it wasn't a great idea to do single-purpose solutions, but it's clearly not something that's going to work for us going forward. So what we're here to talk about today is a tremendous set of challenges: changing climate, the increasing risk of sea level rise, the risk from growing frequency and severity of extreme weather. All of these things are creating challenges across the country and across a number of sectors and many communities. So this chart, this graph shows you, how the number of declared disasters has been growing. This chart stops at 2010, but since 2010, 85% of all U.S. counties have suffered a presidentially declared disaster. 223 counties have had 5 or more presidentially declared disasters just since 2010. In 2016 alone, we had 2 once-in-a-1,000-year events and several 500-year events with 38 federally declared major disasters. And what's funny is that, except for Hurricane Matthew, there was really only Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Hermine. Of those 38 presidentially declared disasters, only 2 of them were named storms. Almost everything else was heavy rain that is starting to become more and more commonplace, and communities were simply not prepared for it. What's also interesting is that even if we weren't worried about climate change, a lot has changed in the last several decades. This is a global phenomenon, urbanization, which means we're living much more densely. People are migrating from more rural places to more urban places and adding to the density, along with a propensity to migrate to the coasts. So since 1970, we had a 40% increase in population in the counties right along the shoreline. We expect to go up another 8% by 2020. So even if we weren't worried about climate change, the normal everyday risks from storms of the past would pose a lot more potential risk to property and to harm to people. Add sea level rise, add changing climate, and now that risk becomes really severe. And it's not just on the coast, but a lot of what we're talking about has its worst effects on the coast. The most common effect of a changing climate is going to be elevated temperature. 2016 was the first year in well over 1 million years in which the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere did not fall below 400 parts per million. That's kind of the alarm level that our scientists around the globe have agreed is the point of no return. 2016 was the warmest year on record, as 2015 was before that, as 2014 was before that. And over the past quarter century, average global sea level has risen at a rate of about 1.2 inches a decade, more than twice as fast as the average 20th century rate. And that's before we've seen the potential large-scale glacial melt and Antarctic ice shelf melt that could really be a big game changer. So in addition to sea level rise and elevated temperature, more coastal flooding, more drought. Just to sort of summarize, by 2050, annual losses from coastal storms alone are expected to increase by $9 billion. That's like having a Superstorm Sandy every few years. It's a lot. So you've heard that term, homes underwater. Normally we're talking about negative equity, right? We just came out of the Great Recession and we use that term a lot to say that the amount that was owed on these houses was more than what was larger than the value of the house. But of course, there's a more literal way to think about underwater. If sea levels rise as much as climate scientists predict by the year 2100, almost 300 U.S. cities would lose at least half of their homes, with 36 U.S. cities being completely lost. Using maps released by NOAA, showing which parts of coastal states will be underwater if sea levels rise by 6 feet, in conjunction with their database of information on more than 100 million homes nationwide. This is analysis that Zillow did and released last year, determining which properties were at risk of being submerged, at least their ground floors, in the next century or so, and what they're currently worth. Nationwide, almost 1.9 million homes, or roughly 2% of all U.S. homes, worth a combined almost $1 trillion, are at risk of being underwater by 2100. And in some states, the fraction of properties is alarmingly high. I'll single out Florida, where 1 in 8 properties are in an area expected to be underwater, that's nearly half of the loss of housing value is in Florida alone. So that gives you some idea of how significant that might be. But people are still buying property in Florida, last I looked, on the North Carolina coast and Virginia Beach. Miami's got a torrid housing market. What the heck is going on? So part of what we're going to talk about this evening is our homeowners, our property owners, getting the signals from their trusted institutions that they should be getting about what's coming down the pike. And if not, why not? So insurance companies, are they giving us the information that we need to have in order to make a risk-adjusted decision? What about, the federal government? Are you getting the right signals from your own federal government? What about the bond rating agencies who basically rate both private and public debt instruments? What about mortgage lenders who are writing 30-year mortgages? Are they looking at these issues? It turns out that everybody thinks the risk is being covered by somebody else or that the government will bail them out. And that's not an entirely ridiculous theory, that last part. It certainly happened. It happened in 2008, right, with the, after the credit crisis. But it may not be a great thing to rely on going forward, and I'll explain a little bit more why that is. When we talk about insurance, we can't ignore the federal flood insurance program called NFIP, National Flood Insurance. It's practically the only source of flood insurance for homes and small businesses nationwide. At the end of 2012, NFIP provided more than 5.6 million policies, insuring 1.25 trillion in assets, but collecting only 3.6 billion in total premiums. Together, the top 5 states by the number of policies, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, California, and New Jersey, accounted for 3/4 of all coastal NFIP policies. So that tells you that something that you probably already know, that the risk isn't evenly distributed. And that has some political consequences that we'll talk about in a little bit. But in fact, there are many factors that challenge not just the success, but the survival of NFIP, which is up for reauthorization later this year. So it's due to expire, and already certain folks like the realtors are getting very nervous and sending their missives to Congress to say, don't forget to deal with this. The first one is that the rates are artificially low. They're federally subsidized, and they don't reflect the true risk of coastal flooding. They don't cover the program's costs, especially during the years with exceptionally high damages, which is almost every year these days. As of November of 2012, NFIP was more than $20 billion in debt, and they consistently run a deficit year after year. Now, if there was a subsidized federal market, would a private insurance company be in that space? No, because they can't compete with those rates. They'd charge a higher rate, and who would buy that? So they're only in the market to provide supplemental insurance or to cover parts of the country where NFIP really isn't in play. So NFIP is required for mortgage holders, let's say, who are in the 100-year floodplain. You have to have an NFIP policy, supposedly. Compliance with that is not everything it could be. But as we've been saying, there have been a lot of 1,000-year and 500-year events. So a lot of people are getting flooded who are not in the 100-year floodplain. So some people are buying private policies or NFIP insurance there. Flood maps don't reflect the true risk of coastal flooding. Why is that? Because FEMA looks only backward to make the maps. They only look at what has already been flooded. Now, that'd be great if we didn't expect anything to change in the future. That look in the rearview mirror would be just as good as looking forward, but we know that isn't the case, right? We're seeing much more frequent and severe weather, much heavier rainfalls. That makes sense, right? With rising temperature, the atmosphere can hold more water, and so when it comes down in a much larger amount than we're used to. So they look backward, and they're not predictive. They're not counting for sea level rise or long-term erosion. So in many ways, they're just wrong, right? But that's what almost everybody's relying upon. They make repeated payouts to the same high-risk properties. Insurance claims on properties repeatedly damaged by flooding, what they call repetitive loss properties, have accounted for 1/4 of all NFIP payments since 1978. They represent only 1.3% of the policies, but are expected to account for 15 to 20% of all the future losses. Buyout candidates, right? Wouldn't you think? Well, we'll talk about that soon. And there are exemptions for certain high-risk properties. They allow you to be grandfathered. So if you've already built the structure and then FEMA remaps, you get to keep your lower rate, even though you should be getting a market signal saying, get out of there. Now, Congress is not entirely, unaware of this. In fact, in 2012, they passed a law requiring that the insurance premiums be recalculated to reflect the real risk that coastal homeowners are experienced. What did they do? They howled. They were so angry. They wrote to all of their representatives in Congress, and they said it'll make insurance unaffordable. So what happened in 2014? Congress repealed most of those provisions. So they're still not getting a real market signal. And that's for the people who are insured, right? A lot of people aren't insured. This is a chart that shows the losses from natural catastrophes. The dark blue bars are insured losses, right? The light blue bars are uninsured losses. Look how big those are. The blue line is the 10-year moving average of insured losses, but the red line is the 10-year moving average of total economic losses. Look how that gap is growing. It's true internationally. The U.S. may have the largest uninsured exposure, but Japan, with its earthquakes and tsunamis, is very close. But you can see here that the uninsured gap is really, really large. And as Michelle DePass, as Dean DePass said in her introduction, the burden of a changing climate doesn't fall evenly on people, and that insurance makes a big difference. If everything you own is lost, the difference between what a wealthy person can afford to do as a result and what a poor person can afford to do, it could set a family back a generation in terms of accumulating assets. So people think, won't government cover the losses anyway? And that's not, like I say, out of keeping. But the process in the U.S. is pretty political. So Congress makes an appropriation. This isn't something we're any good at predicting. The FEMA gets a certain amount of money every year, but for most disasters, if they're large enough, Congress will act to appropriate money for those disasters. But let me give you a sense of how political it is. Sandy was kind of a big disaster, right? Kind of big. In order to get a bill through Congress, what had to happen was a disaster, the bill had to encompass all the disasters between 2011 and 2013. That was 209 federally declared disasters in order to get the support in Congress to be able to fund the recovery from Hurricane Sandy. And so in a lot of other places, you don't have that kind of coverage, right? And and I'll talk a little bit more about the distribution of those disasters. And the appetite for funding is generally waning, in part because that distribution is pretty uneven. When the federal government does fund, it can be huge. The appropriations, they take place outside the annual budget process, so I'm just showing you a comparison. That red bar is the Sandy appropriation. I worked at HUD. That's kind of where the red bar meets the black bars. That's a whole year's worth of congressional appropriations for my agency. And look at all the agencies above that, right? That for whom it's maybe many, many times their annual appropriation. It's a lot of money. And some might argue it's not even a great way to fund a recovery, because this kind of disparity occurs with the states to whom we give the money, with the locals to whom we give the money. It's so many times what they're used to managing that they are almost never equipped to do it well, and they're certainly not equipped to be able to gear up instantly to respond, right? To do a recovery operation. Because what does government do well? Rapidly grow and rapidly shrink, right? No. Definitely not. So at HUD, in the wake of Sandy, I was there and said, people just aren't getting what's happening out there, and they're not in any way prepared. We see, the wake, when I say in the wake of Sandy, that was also in the wake of Ike, Irene, Katrina, Andrew, and in some of the same places you wouldn't know that there had been all these hurricanes and all these disasters. So because Hurricane Sandy was relatively generously appropriated, by 2014, the end of 2014, we still had $1 billion left to allocate, and a lot of that money had not ever been spent outside of the Sandy area. So we thought we would hold a contest to allocate the rest of that money, because it had been so many years. Because remember, we were funding disasters that might have occurred in 2011, that the kind of data we collect right after a disaster wasn't very meaningful anymore. So we thought if we held a contest big enough to spark broad interest, and what if we could make the competition itself a process where people learned about disasters in their communities, their risks, their vulnerabilities, et cetera. And part of it was, and how do we make the federal government kind of work better together? So we decided we would hold this National Disaster Resilience Competition. We would do it very bizarrely in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. We would also be further bizarre in that we would partner with 25 other federal agencies to do it. So they helped write the Notice of Funding Availability, which is the rules for the competition. They participated in more than 24 resilience academies. I'll talk about those in a minute with the Rockefeller Foundation and with applicants. They sat on panels to evaluate applications. And most importantly, they've, since the competition, aligned their own resources and efforts with the contest winners and the applicants who weren't successful to try to fund some of the projects that were teed up and identified in this competition. So the eligible applicants was every state in the United States except, tragically, Nevada and South Carolina. It was 67 total jurisdictions, including Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, and some local governments. So we went really broad, right? So what an amazing opportunity to be able to talk to the people in those jurisdictions. That's a lot of coverage. And then we ran the competition in a way that was unlike any other that's ever been run. Long, really long, a year long, 2 phases. So I won't blame the engineers for that. I'll blame governments for this. If you were to say to anybody, I've got a bunch of money that I want to spend on making you fill in the blank, more resilient, happier, more efficient, greener, whatever, for manufacturing, for roads, for whatever, they would say, I've got a project. I've got a project already. How great, how excellent. Let me show you my project and you can give me the money. Turns out that project was pulled out of some 40-year-old bag, right? It wasn't a great idea 40 years ago. It's a terrible idea today, but every jurisdiction has dozens of those projects, right? And they just wanted to hand you some old project and hope that it would get funded. We said, no, we're not going to do that. In fact, you can't even mention the word project in the first phase of this competition. Instead, you have to partner with lots of different organizations in your community to identify what your real risks and vulnerabilities are, because whatever they are, they aren't what they were 40 years ago. So show us that you understand what's happening in your community. And let's not just look at shocks. Let's not talk about storms, right? And big flooding events. What are the chronic stresses? Things like poverty, economic isolation, underemployment, lack of transportation choices, things that you might have other plans that you're trying to address elsewhere in your government, because these are problems most places are trying to solve. So what if you looked at those risks, vulnerabilities, shocks, and stresses, and came up with a whole bunch of partners with a set of ideas, not projects, an approach that you want to take that would help to address this range of issues. Okay, what if you did that? So out of 67 potential applicants, we ended up selecting 40 winners who could move on to phase 2. Now in phase 2, that was a 180-day first phase. In the second phase, we said, okay, you can talk to us now about projects. But they have to be projects based on the conclusions you reached in phase 1. So it has to be something that fixes these other issues that you've identified. And so we got an amazing set of projects, and those projects all had to make their state or community stronger, less disparate, more diverse, more resilient, more able to not just withstand or recover from an event. And not all events are going to be climate related. The biggest event we've had recently, right, is the recession. I lived in a jurisdiction where the recession was absolutely a bounce forward moment for the District of Columbia. I saw hundreds of cars drop off the DMV rolls beginning in 2008. I thought people were fleeing our jurisdiction. I was like, I've only been in the job a year. How can you already be leaving? But they weren't doing that. They were dialing down their transportation expenses. 2-car households became 1-car households. 1-car households became 0-car households. Almost no foreclosure or bankruptcy. People were able to weather the economic downturn, and boy, the city bounced back so rapidly, gaining regional job share and regional population share. It increased its revenue 600% in 10 years because of the population that began to move to the city. So the inherent advantages of the city ended up being, and it wasn't just the district, it was the 3 close-in jurisdictions, but in the same jobs and housing market, there were huge differences in how people weathered the recession. It made almost every jurisdiction in the Washington region aspire to be transit-oriented because that transportation choice was a big divider. So the out of all of those potential applicants, we ended up funding 13 grantees, 8 states and 5 local governments, so this was in 10 states total, 43 individual projects, 220 different partners for those projects, and they leveraged, for our $1 billion, they brought $5 billion. So it was pretty awesome. And I have to say, the best thing about this, from my perspective, was not that we had these great winners, and I'll talk about a couple of things that they elected to do, and I think so will some of our other speakers, but the people that didn't win, many of them said to us, if we had to do it all over again, we would still enter this competition, even though we spent a lot of our own money and a lot of our own time, and it did take a year. Because we learned so much more about what our real issues are, and now we have all of these partners to be able to begin to address it. And I was like, okay, like this is great, because the federal government doesn't have enough money to address all these issues. And we put money out all the time in every single agency. What if we put the money out in such a way that the money became the change that we were trying to see, the contest itself, not how the money got spent? Like what they had to do, what they had to change, who they had to partner with. Everyone had to make a permanent commitment and make a demonstrated commitment. They made changes. Every place that didn't get any money still made changes. So those are hugely important things. And for us, it was a great learning experience and a great partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. They put $8 million into this competition to fund a series of more than 24 resilience academies around the country. It was really an amazing effort. And you would say, why would a foundation share any project with the federal government who prints the money? And I think from Rockefeller's perspective, they're like, oh, wow, for $8 million, we can leverage $6 billion. That's a good ROI. That's a really good ROI. And look at how many places we can touch. We could never put $1 billion out on our own, but for $8 million, we could really have a huge influence. And so it was a great partnership with them, and it really, I think, affected a lot of what the federal government is doing. Even FEMA is now looking at some things that are based on what happened in the NDRC. And every project did multiple things. Controlled flooding while creating new parkland and recreational amenities, preventing storm surge while creating new capacity, a whole new category of local employment to design and to build and to maintain those new stormwater facilities, and it was like that in every single project. So let's talk about other players in this game. When we talk about infrastructure, almost everything that the state or federal government puts out gets a bond rating, right? So they use a lot of debt to finance infrastructure projects. This is a quote from the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010. They were talking about the housing bubble, but they could be talking about this particular bubble, right? So there are 3 leading global credit rating agencies, and they look at the creditworthiness of debt issuers. That includes companies and governments through ratings. They look at factors that ostensibly assess creditworthiness, looking at legal, regulatory, operational, and other risks. Climate change presents a risk, right? They issue debt, they rate debt that is short-term, 10-year, 20-year, 30-year. They've rated century bonds that are 100 years. Do you think in some places 100 years from now the climate picture might be different? They're not looking at it, not at all. What about in the energy sector, right? I mean, in order to not have a totally devastated planet, we're going to have to move away from fossil fuels. Those are on the balance sheets of lots and lots of companies. And if you were suddenly going to write it off, it would affect the creditworthiness of those companies, but it's not something they're yet doing. They look in their own analysis at 5 years. That's how far forward they look. Yet the risks that they're asking to rate bonds for is much, much longer. And not only that, but they're kind of sending a mixed signal. For those places that do want to invest in infrastructure that might help protect them against rising sea levels, they kind of look at all debt the same, bad. So they'd like everybody to have as little debt as possible. That makes their credit worthiness better, even if one kind of debt is for an investment that is about the existential nature of that community, whether it's even going to exist or not, and another debt might be for a baseball stadium, right? So they look at it pretty much the same. So I'll just say there's a lot of room for improvement, and that when you look at bond ratings across the world, all of North America pretty much gets a pass, because of the diversified nature of the economies and because of other things that relative to other places in the world where there really isn't a lot of capacity and where they might be even more vulnerable than we are, they're in better shape, right? But let's look at something as essential. So it's all green, right? For North America. This is water supply in 2050, right? With climate change effects. Water supply. I mean, how nice is it going to be to live in a place where there's no water, or it's difficult or expensive to get the water? I mean, could that affect the overall financial health of a community? I think so. So I'm just saying that there are all these factors that are out there that should be priced into all of our institutional decisions that really aren't there. My favorite is real estate and mortgage lending, where we already know, what a great job they did in 2008 and before. But many economists are now saying that climate-related reckoning needs to happen a lot faster than it is, and that urgently home buyers need to be better informed. Some analysts say that the economic impact of a collapse of waterfront property markets could surpass the dot-com and the 2008 bursting bubbles. So it's only a matter of time, according to Freddie Mac and their chief economist, before sea level rise and storm surges become so unbearable along the coast that people will leave, ditching their mortgages and potentially triggering another housing meltdown. Except unlike the 2008 crisis, when your house is underwater, is there any value left to recover? Oh, wait, there isn't. So there's nothing. And how many people have almost all of their wealth in their home equity? A lot, right? So this is bad. And what's interesting is so many places are taking such diverse strategies. I mentioned Miami, right, where you would think it wouldn't be such a hot real estate market, but some of their strategy is to get as many people and as much value built up there as possible so as to be able to pay for a solution that would save that part of the country. The problem is there's not yet been a solution designed that could deal with the limestone basis of their subsurface. So you can build a seawall and the water will just come under and up, through the Everglades and through other anyway. So you get the point. It may not work, that strategy, and yet a lot of people are still buying and investing. And I think once, while the real estate and mortgage markets have been slow to confront the change, I think that when it starts to happen, it's going to happen very, very fast, and people are going to be caught, unawares. So increasingly, the question will be, just like it was across the pond, should we stay or should we go? I love the clash. So figuring out what we do affects both the funding and the financing that are available to do it and the public support for doing it, right? You have to make the case kind of either way, but in many places they're really trapped not knowing what to do. And part of it is the way we frame the choices, and there's a lot of room for improvement there. But this is Lower Manhattan, and in a lot of cases, like this is a artist's rendition, OMA's rendition of a seawall, which was a tried and true technology, and a reflexive approach. If I'd asked someone to pull something out of their 40-year-old bag for Lower Manhattan, this is what it would have looked like, and it does work, but it's ugly, and it cuts people off from the water, and there are lots of other things. So there's a lot of real estate value in Lower Manhattan, and that helps to allow a lot more choices. But imagine that you were trying to do something like this in Norfolk, or Virginia Beach, or some other place where sea level rise is having a much bigger effect, but you don't have this property base, right, to help pay for it. You would have to do something more like this, where the thing that's providing the protection is providing other things as well. So this is what they originally called the Big U, now is the Dry Line. We're going to hear a little bit more about it, I think. We funded it through the Rebuild by Design, but it was the biggest single project that got funding out of the National Disaster Resilience Competition, because it's a really good project. But the character of the protection from storm surge looks different in every neighborhood, in fitting with the needs and the character of that neighborhood, and it creates a real amenity. And there's so many places in the country that are vulnerable yet lacking in amenities. So you can imagine how you could garner support for something that did more than one thing and did it very, very well. So that's a huge thing. So one of the things that I've been working on recently is also saying money might be there if you knew where to look. What if you are already funding projects? In fact, 2 to 3% of GDP every year goes to fund state and local infrastructure projects. Are any of them building resilience into those projects? Almost none of them are. So we've started doing workshops with local governments saying, let's mine your CIP for opportunities to do resilience projects, or not just resilience. Let's talk about those shocks and stresses. Let's add some additional transportation modes. Let's create some additional green spaces. Let's make it safer, for pedestrians every day, or bikers every day, not just safe for when there's a big storm. It turns out that if you were to fund a project that was going to manage a gallon of stormwater all on its own, it might cost $1.50 a gallon. If you were going to manage that, if you were going to add on to an existing project, you could manage that stormwater for 1/3 of that cost, for 50 cents a gallon. So the money might be there to do that, because you're getting these other benefits, which means you might have other funding sources besides the Public Works Department to get these other benefits. So that's what we're trying to get local governments to figure out. This might be there. One of the things that we did last summer was work with Milwaukee's water utility to do this very thing. They can issue their own debt, and they've been doing some amazing park building that looks, it's stormwater management, but it's amazing park facilities that they're totally willing to manage and maintain, and it's increasing the property values in the neighborhoods where they're happening. So there's a deal to be struck with the local governments about maybe co-sharing the cost of that kind of infrastructure. So we think there's lots and lots of opportunity to do this, and that it's an important way to go forward. The other way is to think about, how do we engage all the gajillions of property owners out there? I said no one's getting a signal. Programs that engage property owners and homeowners in stormwater management also help them understand what some of these threats are. And usually these are small things that they're doing, but for the homeowner, the co-benefits might make it worth the homeowner's while to pay for most of it with only a small contribution from the government. Because if you put in a cistern that you now use to water your plants, that means you're not using potable water that you have to pay for to do that work. If you're putting a green roof on, it might be cooling your home and lowering your electricity bill. So there are lots of reasons to find these co-beneficiaries and figure out ways to do this. And like I say, you also begin to send people that important signal about what is happening in their community and how to prepare for it, and also make it more likely that they would support maybe taxing themselves to take the actions that need to be taken, whether that's investing in protection so they can stay, or helping the most vulnerable places go. And going isn't a new phenomenon. In so much of the country, especially among traditional Native American communities where life was based more on hunting and fishing, it really wasn't until we required people to go to public school that a lot of communities became anchored in a given place. Otherwise, they would move as the climate and the changing coastline, et cetera, would mandate. Now they're more or less anchored in place and in some very vulnerable places, all around the country, but in Alaska in particular. But the town of Bridgewater on Hog Island in Virginia moved at near the beginning of the last century. Just a little tidewater slip of land that kept getting eroded. And it wasn't till after a big incident that took place, in the 1930s that 1933, most of the residents then floated their homes via barge to a safer spot. I mean, the government wasn't there to help them do it, but they understood that their very existence was threatened, and they had to do something about it. Soldiers Grove, Grand Forks, these are examples of other places where communities made the decision, with some federal money, to relocate rather than repeatedly recover from a disaster in locations where they were clearly vulnerable. In many places, people make both decisions. They do a little bit of staying, they do a little bit of going. So we funded 2 projects in Louisiana. The state of Louisiana was an NDRC winning applicant. One was LA Safe, which was kind of being that gap filler, working with states and working with other state agencies and with local governments to provide the gap financing to plan, design, construct rehab projects. I mean, what they're doing for the project we did in Lafayette with the local government, mining their CIP, they're going to be doing the mapping of where the flood risk is so that we can overlay the CIP projects where the flood risks are the greatest, and so that it's having the things that they are going to spend money on are having the biggest impact. And that's a big cost, but they're going to do that to help the local government be able to implement an effective local strategy. The same application from Louisiana also asked for funds to relocate the people that live on Ile de Jean Charles, a historically and culturally rich island that had been home to many people in 2 tribal communities, including the Chitimacha Choctaw tribe. By 2015, it had already seen a 98% loss of land since 1955. The road you see in the photograph is frequently underwater, totally cutting off their access. So the plan proposed was to relocate the current and past residents of Ile de Jean Charles to a more resilient, historically contextual community. And you're going to hear maybe a little bit more about it, or maybe we'll have some discussion in the Q&A. But I think we're ready to move on to the panel discussion. It is a lot about do we stay or do we go, but also, how can we collectively be prepared to make these decisions, and how can the institutions that serve us, government and other, give us the right information to help us make informed decisions, because a lot of people are putting everything at risk in order to live in particular places that might be very, very vulnerable to a changing climate. So I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.